Hello everybody and welcome to my channel. My name is Catherine, but nobody calls me that, so you guys can call me Kate if you want. Now, this is my very first YouTube video, so if I seem inexperienced, that's because I am. I'm still learning the ropes of editing and all that fun stuff, so try and cut me some slack. Hopefully I'll get better with time. But yes, as you can tell from the title, today's video is on MKUltra. So without further ado, let's dive right in. In case any of you are completely unaware and have no idea what MKUltra is, I'll give a quick summary in my own words. So the best way I can describe it is that MKUltra was a series of experiments conducted by the CIA through the 1950s to the 70s that had a goal of producing mind-controlling drugs and finding the most effective methods for interrogation, along with, some other more not so widely accepted goals of, brainwashing and destroying the human brain, so that's good. Now, on the origins of the entire MKUltra projects, we have to go back to the root of it all, the CIA. Big surprise. The CIA stands for the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America, and when the CIA was founded, its purpose was to create an information agency for foreign policy, intelligence, and analysis. During the Cold War, however, its main goals were spying on Soviet countries and undermining those governments. Today, its primary purpose is to collect, analyze, evaluate, and disseminate foreign intelligence, and to carry out covert operations. This is a quote from their website. Quote, "At the CIA, our mission is to preempt threats and further U.S. national security objectives by collecting foreign intelligence that matters, producing objective all-source analysis, and conducting effective covert action as directed by the president." Okay, from this quote, the main thing we should take is that they are directly influenced by the president. So we can assume that the MKUltra project was to threaten Soviet countries and under the command of Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, JFK, and Lyndon B. Johnson, as that would coordinate with the time period, the 50s to 70s. We also have to acknowledge that the CIA took heavy influence from the experiments of the Axis powers during World War II. For example, at the Dachau concentration camp, Nazi doctors had conducted extensive experiments with mescaline, a psychedelic hallucinogen obtained from a cactus, much like LSD, which we'll get into later. The CIA was very interested in figuring out whether mescaline could be the key to mind control, which was, once again, one of their big avenues of investigation. In Japan, one scientist conducted an experiment known as Unit 731. This was a biological and chemical warfare research and development unit that caused horrific events, including the bubonic plague attacks in the Chinese cities of Changde and Ningbo. The Nuremberg Code was even created in the aftermath of the camp experimentation discoveries, and subsequent trials were conducted to address abuses committed by medical professionals during the Holocaust. The Nuremberg Code included the principle of informed consent and required standards for medical research. Despite this, the CIA actually hired the vivisectionists and the torturers who had worked in Japan and in Nazi concentration camps to come and explain what they had found so that the USA could build on their research. And according to the limited MKUltra statistics, 90% of MKUltra human test subjects were completely unaware of the tests that were being performed on them. So the person who actually gave Project MKUltra the green light to begin was CIA Director Allen Dulles. In April 1953, Dulles appointed an American chemist known as Sidney Gottlieb to be head of the secret project. While in power, Gottlieb himself administered LSD and other hallucinogenic drugs to subjects and financed psychiatric research and development of, quote, techniques that would crush the human psyche to the point that it would admit anything. This is good start. He sponsored certain lovely physicians, most notably Donald Cameron and Harris Isbell, in controversial psychiatric research, including, here it comes, non-consensual human experiments. And his list of not so great actions continues, because Gottlieb was proven to be the person who administered LSD to U.S. Army bacteriologist Frank Olson, leading to Olson's death. Gottlieb also had a weird obsession with Fidel Castro. I guess that was in the Cold War spirit. I don't really know. But in March 1960, under the Cuban Project, another CIA plan approved by President Eisenhower that was influenced by MKUltra, Gottlieb proposed spraying Castro's television studio with LSD and saturating Castro's shoes with thallium to make his beard fall out. Gottlieb also hatched schemes to assassinate Castro, including, but not limited to, the use of a poisoned cigar, a poisoned wetsuit, an exploding conch shell, and a poisonous fountain pen. Let's let that sit for a couple minutes, okay? Gottlieb also played a role in the CIA's attempt to assassinate Prime Minister Lumumba of the Congo by means of poisoning Lumumba's toothbrush. And he also wanted Iraqi General Abdul Hazim's handkerchief to be contaminated with fatal toxin botulinum. Yep. This was the director of MKUltra. And somehow the course of these experiments isn't so inexplicable anymore, right? Now, to get into the actual experiments of MKUltra, let's begin with LSD. So LSD played a major role in the MKUltra project, if not the main role. For a little background on LSD, LSD was invented when a Swiss scientist accidentally combined different types of fungi while looking for a blood stimulant. He realized after accidentally ingesting it that a dose of 25 micrograms, which is equal to the weight of a few grains of salt, is capable of producing vivid hallucinations. Because of its similarity to a chemical present in the brain that produces certain aspects of psychosis, LSD immediately intrigued psychiatrists, especially those working in the warfare industry. Quickly, American researchers in the CIA noted that LSD is, quote, capable of rendering whole groups of people, including military forces, indifferent to their surroundings and situations, interfering with planning and judgment, and even creating apprehension, uncontrollable confusion, and terror. MKUltra began by administering LSD to mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts, and sex workers. Quote, people who could not find back, as one agency officer put it. Most of these patients were completely unaware of the dosages of the drug, but the lengths the scientists had to reach to be satisfied were extreme. One patient had LSD administered to him for 174 days straight. MKUltra wanted to create a way to seize control of people's minds, and they realized it was a two-part process. First, you had to blast away the existing mind, and second, you had to find a way to insert a new mind into that resulting void. LSD experimentation was to solve the first problem, that is, of destroying the existing mind. A submission of MKUltra, known as the Midnight Climax, was where operatives involved hired prostitutes in San Francisco to lure clients back to brothels. Once there in these CIA-run brothels, the agents secretly drugged their targets and watched them engage in sexual activities from behind a two-way mirror. Other MKUltra specialties were tested in these brothels, such as stink bombs, itching and sneezing powders, and diarrhea inducers. A Stanford chemist sent these substances out to California for testing, along with such delivery systems as a mechanical launcher that could throw foul-smelling objects 100 yards, glass ampules that could be stepped on in a crowd to release any of the powders, a fine hypodermic needle to inject drugs through the cork of a wine bottle, and drug-coated swizzle sticks. Now, even though this series of experiments sounds incredibly comical, there were real human victims as a result of these programs of Project Midnight Climax, including at least one death. Numerous subjects suffered permanent mental and psychological degradation as well. One MKUltra leader, which I briefly mentioned earlier, Donald Cameron, had plans that were not only limited to drugs. As I mentioned earlier, MKUltra focused on the two-part process of seizing control of people's minds, destroying the existing mind and inserting a new mind. Shock therapy was a quote-unquote possible solution to the first aspect, just like LSD was, destroying the existing mind. Cameron's quote-unquote driving experiments consisted of putting subjects into drug-induced comas for weeks weeks at a time, up to 3 months in one case. And while people were in these induced comas, he would play tape loops of noise or simple repetitive statements non-stop, on repeat, in hopes of breaking down the patient's mind. His experiments were often carried out on patients who entered the institute for common problems such as anxiety disorders and postpartum depression, many of whom suffered permanent effects from his actions and were not very badly off beforehand. His treatments resulted in things that include victims' urinary incontinence, amnesia, forgetting how to talk, forgetting their parents, and thinking their interrogators were their parents. And for an example of the actual electroshock therapy, we can use the story of one woman. In 1956, Velma Orlikow arrived at a psychiatric hospital called the Allen Memorial Institute. She had just had a child and was suffering from serious depression. She was only irritable and she just couldn't sleep. She was put under the care of Dr. Cameron. On some days and throughout the entire day, she would receive high voltage electroshock therapy. The voltage was much higher than had been used before in other hospitals, up to 30 to 40%. That in itself would be bad enough, and that's not how you treat postnatal depression. On other occasions, and here's where the drugs come back into play, Cameron tried something else on Orlikow. He'd give her such a massive dose of drugs that she'd fall into a drug-induced coma. She'd be paralyzed, and when she would wake up, she wouldn't know what would be happening or who she was. And when she woke up, Cameron would shock her again, and there would be even more confusion. But the worst thing, the thing that really messed her up, is she was sometimes given huge doses of LSD, and she would be reduced in that hospital to the state of a young child. She'd whimper in corners, and phlegm would dribble down her chin. She'd lose the ability to speak and to perform even the most basic of tasks. Her brain was erased, but controlling that brain was another matter. Dr. Cameron tried, however. But this is on quite the sad note how our segment on electroshock therapy ends. Now, there's not much information on this portion of research, but it definitely came up quite often on all the websites I was using, even though there was very little information, so I thought it would be best to include it. In American-controlled territories, mostly Japan, Germany, and the Philippines, the CIA created secret detention centers so that the US could avoid criminal prosecution, basically by preventing the committing of all the unauthorized, non-consensual experimentation on US soil. They could avoid being legally reprimanded for it. So the CIA captured those suspected of being enemy agents and other people deemed quote-unquote expendable to perform various types of torture and human experimentation on. The prisoners were interrogated while being administered psychoactive drugs, electroshock therapy, and subjected to extremes of temperature, sensory isolation, and the like to develop a better understanding of how to destroy and to control human minds. Now here's just some weird stories I stumbled upon while I was researching. So this is back to Dr. Cameron and Velma Orlikow. Sometimes under the influence of LSD, he'd strap her and other patients to chairs, and he would read them the dystopian novel called A Clockwork Orange by Stanley Kubrick. He'd then play them messages on repeat for days on end about their new personalities or personalities he was trying to get them to embody. And this was a way to reprogram their minds. So he had destroyed their minds through LSD and electroshock therapy, and now he was trying to rebuild their mind into what he wanted it to be. So endlessly, they'd listen to all the positive things about their new personality, and then the recording would switch to all the negative things. This is what Orlikow's granddaughter said about that process. Quote, "He couldn't get his patients to listen to them enough, so he put speakers in football helmets and locked them on their heads. They were going crazy, banging their heads into walls, so he then figured he could put them in a drug-induced coma and play the tapes as long as he needed." Documents revealed that her grandmother, Velma Orlikow, had received megadoses of LSD on 14 different occasions. Every time she'd turn away, pleading with the nurses not to give her another dose. When she did that, the nurses would shout at her, telling her that she was an evil mother, a bad person, that she was refusing the very stuff that would make her a better person. And this, as you might imagine, was a very sensitive aspect of her personality since she was suffering from postnatal depression. After the doses, Orlikow often screamed, telling the nurses that her skin was melting off her bones, and she suffered that for 3 months. In Kentucky, 1954, a CIA operative prison doctor isolated 7 inmates together and fed them double, triple, and quadruple doses of LSD for 77 days straight in order to see how they would interact with one another. I don't know what the purpose of this experiment was. I barely found any information on it. No one knows what became of the victims, and it's assumed that they died without even knowing they were taking part in MKUltra. I don't know why this would help their goals of interrogation or even mind control, to see how people would interact with each other on LSD while being literally insane. So take from that what you will. And we'll end it on this story because it'll make it a full 360. One of the most well-known victims of the MKUltra experiments was Frank Olson, someone I mentioned earlier as Gottlieb's most famous victim. Olson was a CIA officer who had spent his entire career at CIA base and MKUltra base Fort Detrick, and he knew its deepest secrets. When he began musing about quitting the CIA, his co-workers saw a security threat. Gottlieb summoned the MKUltra directive team to a retreat and arranged for Olson to be drugged with LSD. A week later, Olson died in a plunge from a hotel window in New York. The CIA called it suicide. Olson's family believes that he was thrown from the window to prevent him from revealing what was brewing inside Camp Detrick. Conspiracy theorists think that Gottlieb successfully mind controlled him into jumping out of the window himself. Nobody really knows, and I guess we never will, just like the majority of the MKUltra experiments. In the aftermath of Project MKUltra, many investigative efforts were attempted. However, these were hampered by CIA Director Richard Helm's order that all MKUltra files be destroyed in 1973. Later investigations relied on the sworn testimony of direct participants and on the relatively small number of documents that survived Helm's destruction order. In 1977, a Freedom of Information Act request uncovered a cache of 20,000 documents relating to Project MKUltra, which led to Senate hearings later that year, and some surviving information regarding MKUltra was declassified in July 2001. In December 2018, further declassified documents revealed a letter to an unidentified doctor discussing work on 6 dogs made to run, turn, and stop via remote control and brain implants. And after retiring in 1972, Gottlieb dismissed his entire effort for the CIA's MKUltra program as useless. The CIA insists that MKUltra type experiments have been abandoned. As far as we know, the program now lives on only in sporadic pop culture references and as a stain for the American government's reputation. Thank you all so much for watching. Like I said, this is my first video and I don't have a camera or a mic or hardly any storage, so I used what I could and did what I could with that. I really appreciate everybody who sees this and has stayed this long. Thank you again. Until next time.